Good day. Sunday, 19th November, today's date. We have an article in the Washington Post by President Biden, no less. An article which, in my opinion, tells us nothing very new and which recites again many of the old tropes and cliches that we've heard from many political leaders, including from obviously President Biden himself, but also others. I will touch on this article briefly in this program. We've also had a very interesting article by Richard Haass in, I believe, Foreign Affairs, and an article by Thomas Graham in the National Interest. All of these trying to find a way out of these problems, these twin problems, the one in the Middle East, the one in Ukraine, but certainly in terms of the situation in Ukraine, one where the situation is deteriorating literally by the day, deteriorating for Ukraine, deteriorating for the Western powers as well. Well, there is nothing there of any real meaningful nature being proposed. Let's just deal first with the military situation. Now, yesterday I spoke of important advances that the Russians appear to be making in the Avdeyevka and Bakhmut areas. There's also been, by the way, a cascade of reports that the Russians are pushing hard now, or starting to push hard, around Kupiansk, these three areas of the battlefronts. Now, Yuri Podolyaka, who is a commentator, a Russian commentator on the Russian side, though he's actually was a citizen of Ukraine originally, and I understand that his hometown is Sumy in northern Ukraine. Anyway, he did a program yesterday in which he discussed the fighting in Avdeyevka in considerable detail, and he suggested that the Russians are in the process now of conducting what might be described as active reconnaissance of Ukrainian positions. They appear to have captured, according to him, most, even if not yet all, of the industrial zone in the south. At least that was my understanding of what he said. And he also spoke about Russian probing attacks in the north towards the village of Ostoshenia, towards Deborgc, beyond this village of Stepovoye, which the Russians have pushed the Ukrainians out of, but which they haven't themselves occupied. And perhaps more importantly, and most ominously for the Ukrainian soldiers trying to defend Avdeyevka itself, apparently Russian troops have entered at various times the Avdeyevka coke factory and the other industrial facilities to the northwest of Avdeyevka. And what happens in all of these attacks that I've just been talking about, not the ones in the south where the Russians do seem to be steadily pushing through the industrial zone, and perhaps the outer residential subjects of Avdeyevka in their advance from the southeast. But anyway, these other places, that the Russians advance, they send in small groups of men, and, by the way, on occasion tanks, one or two tanks rumbling in, carrying out raids, observing the situation, then retreating. After sometimes they launch their own artillery strikes. The tanks fire their main guns at particular targets, and then they pull back. But what the Russians appear to be doing is that they're probing the state of the Ukrainian defenses in the further places that they intend to attack. And they're doing that even as they are pushing, as I said, faster in the south, in the area of the industrial zone, and perhaps the outer residential suburbs in the southeast of Avdeyevka. And as they steadily, incrementally widen their control of the area of the railway track in the northwest to the northwest of Avdeyevka, the importance of which was discussed in great detail by a Ukrainian soldier who was interviewed by the Spanish newspaper El País, and which I discussed a couple of days ago. So this is what the Russians are doing. They're carrying out what would appear to be a reconnaissance in force of the remaining Ukrainian defensive positions. And Podolyak suggested that the purpose of these armed reconnaissance advances by Russian reconnaissance troops was to establish exactly where the Ukrainians are, what their major defense points are, where they have their mortars and machine guns and such artillery as they have left in this area, so that when the major Russian attack comes, the Russians will know where the Ukrainians are defending and when to strike. And I'm sure that this is correct. Now, the other point that Podolyak made, and it's been made by many others, by the way, is that we are now in the deep period of the Rasputitsa, the mud. That this is a time of heavy, swampy ground, muddy ground, right across the battlefronts in Ukraine. That makes movement of men and machines difficult. I suspect, by the way, and contrary to what some Ukrainian generals were claiming back in the late summer, I suspect that it's actually in some places easier for machines, provided they're properly designed for this, for machines to move across this muddy ground than for soldiers. In some places, the ground is so soft that soldiers who try to march across what is not perhaps exactly a swamp, but very soft ground, would find movement extremely difficult. And as somebody who has done walking as a leisure activity, I can actually say how tough it is to walk across soft ground as soft as that. But anyway, this is the time of the Rasputitsa, the time of fogs and mists. It's the time of very soft soil. It's the time of heavy rains before the frosts come and the ground hardens and the light becomes clearer and the rain turns to snow. And notoriously, it is very difficult to advance in the period of the Rasputitsa. So it makes logical sense that the Russians in and around Avdeyevka are carrying out what might be called forceful reconnaissance, finding out where the Ukrainian defense positions are. And apparently the Rasputitsa is now not far from its final end. The cold weather will start reasonably soon. The ground will harden as the water turns to ice, becomes frozen, and at that point it will be much easier for the Russians to start their advances in Avdeyevka and in other places. Now, that begs a very interesting question, because the Russians, of course, have been attacking right across the battlefronts throughout the period of the Rasputitsa. They did so in Kupiansk, in the Vremevka salient area, in Avdeyevka, where they've made significant advances despite the soft ground, despite the muddy conditions. And why have they been doing that? Why have they been pushing the Ukrainians hard at this particular time? when normally one would expect fighting to die down. Well, I'm going to make a suggestion, and I don't think this is unique to me. I'm sure others have made it also. But I suspect that the Russians are doing this because they don't want to give the Ukrainians any time to rest and recuperate and try to rebuild their forces, rest their troops, re-equip with new armor and new build up their stockpile of shells before the winter comes. In other words, the Russians are keeping the Ukrainians active. They're keeping them busy. They're fighting them in every place. They're continuing to burn up Ukrainian reserves. I am sure that this is the major purpose of that advance towards Kupiansk, for example. I suspect that one of the reasons the Russian advance around Kupiansk has been relatively slow is again because of the Rasputitsa, but the Russians continue the pressure. They gradually, incrementally push forward despite the Rasputitsa, and that forces the Ukrainians to commit reserves, to send in troops, to use artillery, to use tanks and Bradleys, and the tanks and the Bradleys, the Leopard 2s and the Bradleys are, as far as I can tell now, all over the battle lines. You will find them in multiple places. You will find them in Avdeyevka, you will find them close to Bakhmut, you will find them in the Kupiansk region as well, which begs the question of which units of the Ukrainian army are operating these machines, or is that unhappy brigade, the 47th Mechanized Brigade, built up by the Western powers, trained by the Western powers last winter, equipped with the Bradleys and the Leopard 2s, intended to punch through the Russian defense lines in Zaporozhye region and open the way for the further advance to the Black Sea. Is it now the case that this brigade has become a kind of fire brigade, a force that the Ukrainians are obliged to rush to different parts of the front line, dispersing it into small groups, penny packets, trying to hold positions in different places as the Russians continue to advance? Well, I don't know the answer to that question, by the way, and I'm not going to try to answer it or even to guess what the truth is. We know that the 47th Brigade is located in close to Avdeyevka, is trying to conduct some kind of defense there. It may be that elements of this brigade have also been deployed to the Bakhmut area and to Kupiansk, but I'm not going to try to probe all of its various deployment positions. These are the sort of things that others, Riba, Dima at the Military Summary Channel, are far better capable of doing than me. But anyway, that I think is the Russian purpose of conducting an offensive, this limited offensive, limited in every place apart from Avdeyevka, where it looks deadly serious, this limited offensive right across the front lines. And that, by the way, leads us to a further point, which is that the Russians have demonstrated by conducting this offensive in the way that they have done, that they have now the ability to continue to advance through the Rasputitsa period, even if the advance that they conduct is in most places, but not, also it seems to me, in Avdeyevka, of a relatively limited nature. The Russians have obviously long knowledge of the Rasputitsa. This is, after all, their part of the world. Ukraine, for most of Russia's modern history, was a region of Russia. So the Russians are familiar with the terrain, the climate, the wet conditions, the marshy soil, And of course, their tanks and their infantry fighting vehicles, their armored vehicles, are designed to operate in these kind of conditions and can do so to an extent that Western tanks and armored vehicles are unable to do. This was, by the way, also found to be true during the Second World War, as the Germans discovered after their attack on the Soviet Union in 1941, when they too had to come to grips with the Rasputitsa in the autumn of 1941. They found that the Soviet tanks at that time could operate far better in the Rasputitsa than their own. And I think we're seeing this repeat itself this time. And not only is it a case of the Russians having vehicles, armored vehicles, tracked vehicles, which are much better adapted to combat operations in these conditions. But of course, the Russians probably know the tactics, know the way in which to fight in these conditions. The General Staff probably has long-standing manuals going back decades, which they can circulate amongst Russian commanders and Russian soldiers in the field, explaining how a battle in the time of the Rasputitsa is to be conducted. Anyway, that then brings us to the next big question. If the Russians are principally at the moment engaging the Ukrainians, conducting this offensive in order to prevent the Ukrainians resting and recuperating and trying to rebuild their forces following the big summer offensive, the big unsuccessful Ukrainian summer offensive, then why are the Russians doing it? Well, I think here there's another 2 points to make. If the Russians are able to conduct operations in the Rasputitsa, then it must mean that they're also able to conduct offensive operations following the failure of Ukraine's famous summer counteroffensive. Now, it is an article of faith amongst the Ukrainian military leadership, and it is also an article of faith on the part of the Western commentariat and Western governments that despite the failure of Ukraine's summer offensive, the Ukrainians inflicted more casualties during that offensive on the Russians than they themselves suffered. There's never any evidence of this, but this has been the consistent assertion that the Western commentariat, Western governments, the Ukrainians themselves, it's been the consistent thing that they've been saying basically since the start of the war, that the Russians have suffered enormous losses, that their reserves are largely burnt out, that they're exhausted, and that they're unable, therefore, to continue the war. And there's now acknowledgement that Ukraine itself is exhausted and burnt out. So this is part of the premise, part of the reason why people in the West talk about a stalemate. Both armies supposedly are exhausted. Well, that hardly seems right, because what we actually see is that despite the difficult weather conditions, the Russians have nonetheless chosen to use the time of the Rasputitsa to conduct an offensive whose primary purpose, in my opinion, is to exhaust the Ukrainians. Now, that only makes logical sense if the Russians are far from exhausted themselves. If, in fact, they have more machines, more troops, more tanks, more shells, if their troops are becoming increasingly well trained, if their morale is becoming increasingly strong, far from the actions of the Russians over the last 6 weeks or so, since the beginning of October, being consistent with an exhausted army that has suffered massive casualties in fighting off this Ukrainian offensive of the summer. The facts, the actions that the Russians are taking seem much more consistent with what Russian commentators are saying, what has been said by people like Brian Beletic and others, Scott Ritter, Douglas McGregor, yours truly, that the Russians have not only weathered the storm of the Ukrainian counteroffensive successfully, but have done so largely intact with containable losses. Obviously, they suffered some losses, but as I've discussed in many places now, in many occasions now, the media zona reports which seek to track the numbers of Russian losses suggest that, at least the number of Russian fatalities during the war, suggests that following the end of the Battle of Bakhmut in May, Russian casualty numbers started to go into steep decline. This continued throughout the summer, even as Ukraine was conducting its offensive. And remarkably, so far, though one must allow for the possibility of a time lag, that decline in Russian casualty figures, Russian fatalities, that Media Zona is tracking, appears to have continued, to have persisted through the autumn, even during this period when this Russian offensive, the big one in Avdeyevka, the less significant ones in other places, have been underway. So we see that the Russian army, far from being exhausted, run down, broken, lacking reserves, having used up its stocks of shells and artillery pieces and tanks, does seem to have weathered the storm of the offensive well, and does seem to be in a position where it is able to conduct a strong offensive, even in the time of the Rasputitsa, with the Russian command apparently thinking that this is a worthwhile thing for them to do. Well, that's one point to make, but there is another one, and that comes back to my question earlier. Why are the Russians doing it? Well, if they are exhausting the Ukrainians, which it seems to me is what they're doing, if they're conducting attrition against the Ukrainians around Kupiansk, around in the Vremivka salient, in Bakhmut, and if they're pressing hard around Avdeyevka, then that points to a further big Russian offensive that is to come. What the Russians want to do is to obviously prepare their own forces in the rear, build them up to overwhelming levels, but to do so in conditions so that when they launch them, these huge forces that are assembling against the Ukrainian defenses. The Ukrainian defenses are fragile and weak. Ukraine's forces continue to be exhausted and increasingly demoralized, so that when the big punch lands, it lands against an opponent who is already on his last legs. That, it seems to me, is logical. And I've been reinforcing that thinking by an email that I've received today. Now, this email has come from a commentator with a military background who has provided me with consistently accurate information about the progress of the war in many places across the battlefronts in Ukraine since basically the Battle of Bakhmut began. This person has had sources that have been close to the Wagner organization, and he's been able to track and keep me informed about tactics and strategy by the Wagner organization. But he has more extensive knowledge than this. It extends to the conduct of the entire Russian military and Russian military production and all of those things. I don't want to say too much about any of this because I don't want to give clues as to the identity of this person, as I'm sure people will understand. Anyway, this person, who, by the way, has also provided me with some very interesting information about the situation in the Middle East, but I'm going to keep that to one side. This person has been providing me with more suggestions about the way the offensive, the war, might progress. And firstly, he's given me some eye-watering figures about Russian production numbers, and these I absolutely do not intend to disclose because I think that doing so might make it easier for people to, as I said, establish the identity of this person. But the production numbers are eye-watering. The scale of the discrepancy between the machines, the tanks, the artillery, the aircraft, the missiles that the Russians have and the Ukrainians have is now becoming unbelievably lopsided in the Russians' favor. I remember, by the way, reading long ago about the lopsided advantages in men and machines that the Red Army had over the Germans in the closing stages of the Second World War as a result of the massive increases in production that took place in Russia, in the Soviet Union, during the Second World War, and the enormous losses that the Germans suffered. Anyway, suffice to say that the lopsidedness now, according to these figures I've just been provided, is at the same kind of level. Anyway, a hugely lopsided situation in terms of machines and an increasingly lopsided situation in terms of manpower as well. It's no secret now that Ukraine is short of manpower. That article that I read in The Spectator, which again called for further mobilization of Ukrainians. Young people should be rounded up in the cities and thrown into the battle. I've expressed my own deep unhappiness about what was being proposed there. But anyway, it's no longer disputed that Ukraine faces a manpower shortage, that the soldiers who have been fighting on the front lines, the Ukrainian soldiers, are increasingly old. The average age is said to be 43, that they're exhausted, many of them, burnt out in many cases. I've been commenting on reports about how they've told Western journalists that what they want is to go home. There have been protests now from members of their families, increasingly so in Ukraine. Even the Western media has been reporting this. Members of their families calling on the men to be allowed to come home. Anyway, there is definitely a manpower crisis in Ukraine. By contrast, as I've discussed many times in many programs now, the Russians have been recruiting troops in huge numbers, 1,600 a day, according to the Russian Defense Ministry. All of these troops who have been recruited are apparently going through intense and prolonged training programs lasting the better part of a year. But of course, those who joined the military at the start of this year will by now be close to completing their training and might have already done so. And this person who was written to me and who I have consistently found to be well informed, he tells me that I'm actually underestimating the scale of the Russian recruitment drive. He said that the Russians are actually understating the numbers of men who have been joining the military over the course of this year, and that it's actually significantly greater than the Russians themselves are acknowledging. Now, of course, I have absolutely no way of knowing whether that is true or not, but as I said, this person has proved to be consistently well informed up to now. So we see that the Russians are exhausting the Ukrainians, even at the same time as they are building up their forces, and building up their forces to an enormous size. And why would they be doing that? Well, again, clearly a big offensive is at some point coming. Maybe not this winter, maybe in the spring, or perhaps even later, once more of these troops that have been called up have completed their training and the forces are fully ready. There's been suggestions that the Russians are actually thinking of ending the war in 2025, assuming that the call-up is completed by the end of 2024, and that a year is needed to train troops up to the level that the Russians wish. Then all of their forces, which will have been called up this year, will be ready to go into action at the end of 2024, 2025. That might be the plan, or it could be that they're intending to advance sooner than this, or it could be that they're planning something else with the Ukrainians at the moment. But one way or the other, until they're ready for their major advance, they will continue to do what they're doing at the moment, increase the pressure on the Ukrainian lines in every place, build it up steadily and remorselessly, keep the Ukrainians busy, keep exhausting the Ukrainian forces, keep this endless number of casualties going to the rear until eventually, as I said, the big punch lands. And this person who wrote to me suggested where this big punch would come. And he suggested that it will come in the north, in the area of the Russian border, the Ukrainian-Russian border, in the north. In other words, in Kharkiv region, in places like Sumy and Chernigov, and perhaps towards Kiev. And he's pointed out that more and more troops are being stationed there. This person has contacts now across the Russian military, or so he tells me. And what he says, as I said on this, has been correct up to now. He says that more and more Russian troops are apparently assembling in the north, including in Belarus. He says that in Belarus itself, the Russians have been busy refurbishing and updating Belarus's own armoured forces, its tanks and its infantry fighting vehicles and its guns and all of those sort of things. He says that he doesn't personally think that the Belarus military will itself participate in any Russian offensive. But this build-up by the Belarus military itself is going to increase the pressures on the Ukrainians. They're going to wonder what this build-up in Belarus is all about. And he's identified something else, which I too have identified previously, which is that we are now getting more and more reports of cross-border raids by Russian special forces or reconnaissance units across the northern border from Kharkiv region, from the northern part, from the northern border of Russia, into Kharkiv region, into the areas of Chernigov and Sumy and those sort of places. And in the meantime, the Ukrainians obviously have to keep some troops in this northern region, but with the main fighting happening in the east and the south, the Ukrainian defenses in the north are becoming stretched and thin. The Ukrainians have tried to make up for it by planting huge minefields, 500,000 mines apparently, though that, by the way, is significantly less than the vast belts of mines that the Russians laid ahead of their own fortifications in the south and the east. But anyway, huge minefields that the Russians have built in the south and the east. The Ukrainians are trying to do the same in the north. But again, I suspect that the Russians are keeping careful track on these minefields, and they have shown in the past, and they're showing, by the way, in Avdeyevka now, that they have a better understanding and more quantities of the right equipment to clear minefields ahead of the advancing forces. So that's where we are in terms of the overall strategy. In Avdeyevka, Yuri Podolyaka appears to believe that a major attack is coming as soon as the ground hardens and the light clears and the weather turns colder. And I suspect he is right. I suspect the same is true in the Bakhmut area as well. There were reports yesterday that the Russians have now captured the railway station in Klishevka, that they've now reoccupied it, that they are also reoccupying the ruins of the tiny hamlet of Avdeyevka, which the Ukrainians claimed, in fact boasted about its capture. It's just a few weeks ago, but it now seems like an age ago. So the Russians are pushing hard there, and the Russian advance from the north of Bakhmut also continues, and it appears to be gaining strength as well. In the meantime, there's also been more reports from the Vremivka salient area. It seems that the Russians have now been dropping cluster bombs on Ukrainian defenders in the villages of Staromayorsk and Urazhenie, which the Ukrainians captured again, or, fought to capture so ferociously over the course of the offensive there. And the assumption is that, again, the Russians are going to launch a big counterattack, are going to reoccupy these villages. They've been driving the Ukrainians back in the Vremivka salient for some time, and it looks increasingly as if all Ukrainian gains in the Vremivka salient are being reversed. And in the meantime, the war in the air continues increasingly in Russia's favor. I mean, some of the figures that this person I was talking about, I said that they're eye-watering. The figures for production of both strategic and tactical drones like the Geran-2, the Geranium-2 drones that are used by the Russians in their tactical strikes against Ukraine's defense system, its energy system, as well as the tactical drones, the Lancets and drones like that the Russians are using with increasing ability right across the front lines. Well, those figures are eye-watering as well, are absolutely off the scale. And I understand that the other thing that's happened over the last year or so is that the Russians have trained a huge number of drone operators able to operate these drones, and that units, specialized units, to control drones, to control drone strikes, Lancet drone strikes and reconnaissance drones, are now being integrated with Russian military units on the front lines at increasingly low levels. But anyway, the war in the air continues to go increasingly against Ukraine. I've spoken about how the Russians have been dropping cluster bombs on Ukrainian defenders in the Vremivka salient area. But the Russians also last night launched a massive drone attack right across Ukraine. They made their first attacks on the energy system. Not perhaps significant attacks, but undoubtedly significant amounts of damage were done. And the Ukrainian authorities also admitted that a very substantial proportion of the drones that the Russians launched did in fact manage to get through and strike their targets. And of course there continues to be the enigma of what the Russians are going to do with their undoubtedly growing arsenal of cruise missiles. They haven't launched a strategic cruise missile offensive against Ukraine for several months now. There was an article in Newsweek that again resurrected the old trope that the Russians have run out of cruise missiles. I don't think any Western defense ministry believes that any longer. So one wonders how many of these missiles the Russians have stockpiled and what they're going to do with all of these missiles. The reasonable guess is that they will be using them in some kind of operation to support whatever further offensives happen, and they could start being used over the course of the winter. And there's worries in Ukraine that they will be directed specifically at Ukraine's energy system. Well, we shall just have to wait and see. But anyway, major missile offensive by the Russians, or rather drone offensive by the Russians last night. In fairness, Ukraine did launch drones and missiles of its own towards Crimea. From what I can tell, without any real effect, the Russian air defense system seems to have fully mastered the problem caused by Ukrainian missiles and drones. Some Ukrainian drones were again launched against Moscow. This hasn't happened for several weeks now, at least not that I'm aware of, but apparently it happened yesterday. None of the drones appear to have reached their targets. Some debris from the drones, as they were brought down, apparently by electronic warfare, by jamming, fell on some of the roads leading in and out of Moscow, but no significant damage was done. That drone offensive against the big Russian cities and against Moscow itself seems to have failed. And anyway, all of that happening last night, and reports yesterday of the defection of a Ukrainian pilot, of a pilot who flies Su-27 fighter jets. This pilot is supposed to have defected to Russia. There's some reports that he defected with his Su-27, though I haven't seen any confirmation or pictures of this. In fact, I have to say that all the information about this defection, I mean, it does appear to have happened, but so far there isn't a huge amount of information about it. But Dima, the military summary channel, pointed out that this must be an alarming development for the Western powers and for Ukraine as well, because, of course, if Ukrainian pilots are now thinking of defecting, going over to the other side, then they might conceivably bring their aircraft with them. Perhaps they did in this case, this pilot did in this case with his Sukhoi-27. But in the future, if they're flying Western aircraft, F-16s, or conceivably more advanced fighter jets, the Ukrainians have been asking, pleading for more advanced fighter jets than the rather elderly F-16s that they're going to be provided. Well, if Ukrainian pilots are now thinking about defecting in that way, that's surely going to dampen any lingering Western enthusiasm about supplying Ukraine with more advanced fighter jets. For the record, I think this F-16 story has largely run its course. I suspect that the F-16s, when they do appear in the Ukrainian skies, will prove as ineffectual as the ATACMS missiles Ukraine has been supplied with have also proved to be. Anyway, there we go. Bad situation in every part of the battle lines. And I noticed that there was one article in The Hill. I noticed it was actually sent to me by an acquaintance of mine. I won't name her, though I have on previous occasions, but she's been enormously helpful to me in keeping up with things. But anyway, one always has to clutch at straws, and this article is by Brad Dress in The Hill, and it says that Ukraine notches key battlefield victory in war of attrition with Russia. I was wondering what that key battlefield victory would be. It turns out that it is the landing of these 150 Ukrainian soldiers in Kinki, where they've been bottled up for the last couple of weeks, and from whence they have been unable to advance. And this article, I found that there was a comment buried inside it by David Silby, a professor of military history and policy at Cornell University, and he didn't seem to be particularly impressed by this development at Kinki. He said Ukraine has a tiny bit of an upper hand, but it's not much better than the stalemate itself. What we saw over the last couple of months reminds me of nothing so much as the grinding, slugging matches of World War I, where progress is measured in yards rather than miles. Casualties are pretty horrendous. Well, I said already that it's an attrition war, certainly, but it is an attrition war which Ukraine is decisively losing. And one should not make the mistake of thinking that Russia is suffering anywhere near the same levels of attrition as Ukraine is. But anyway, suffice to say that Professor Silby clearly doesn't think that this landing in Kinki is in and of itself going to prove especially decisive. He says it's only a tiny bit of an upper hand and not much better than the stalemate itself. For the record, my own sense is that the operation in Kinki is perhaps moving towards a debacle. Now again, I'm not a military person, and it may be that I'm wrong, and it could be that the Ukrainians have some tricks up their sleeve here, though I can't imagine what they are. But Sladko, the Russian governor of Zaporozhye region, as I discussed in several videos now, said that the Ukrainians had been expecting that their offensive in Kherson across the Dnieper would result in Novaya Kakhovka being captured by the 15th of November, and that they would then be able to push on towards Genishek, and which is on the Black Sea, and that this hasn't happened, which it self-evidently hasn't happened. And If that is true, if Sladko is right, then there is really little purpose in maintaining this bridgehead, because the wider operation has failed. The Russian defences again proved far too strong. There are far too many Russian troops, far too many minefields, trenches, defensive barriers in this region. The Russians have air superiority, they have artillery superiority, they have all of these things. And in fact, clinging on to this bridgehead is coming with ever higher costs. And there's more and more reports. Sladko said that the Ukrainian soldiers in Kinki have a life expectancy of about 2 days. That's his claim. But anyway, there are more and more reports of more and more Ukrainian losses trying to cling on to this bridgehead. I discussed how one of the Marine brigades, Ukrainian Marine brigades in this operation, published on its website a commentary, a bitter commentary, about the level of losses it is suffering, and about the fact that the Ukrainian troops in this area are suffering those losses because of a traitor who supposedly is giving away their positions to the Russians. And my impression is that whereas 2 or 3 weeks ago, when this whole thing started, one could justifiably say that the Ukrainians were holding the initiative in this area. On the Dnieper, for some time now, the initiative has passed back to the side of the Russians. The Russians have bottled up the Ukrainians in this small bridgehead in Kinki, and the bridgehead has changed from a bridgehead into a fire sack, and of course with weather conditions likely to change, with Ukrainian artillery positions on the right bank or the west bank having been pummeled by Russian missile and artillery attacks, with the fog soon likely to clear as the Rasputitsa season ends. It's quite likely that the Russians will be able to cut off this bridgehead entirely and extinguish the Ukrainian resistance there. That's my own assessment of this battle. Now, as I said, it may be that the Ukrainians have some tricks up their hands, which I'm not aware of, but I can't imagine what they are. And I noticed that apparently the Russians have now destroyed a Krab self-propelled gun, a Polish-supplied self-propelled gun that the Ukrainians have been using in various parts of the battlefields, and that this is now being seen in Kherson region. It seems to me that just as we're seeing Bradleys and Leopard 2s being dispersed right across the battlefronts, the Ukrainians are having to disperse their artillery in all kinds of places in order to try to plug the gaps. And this is what's happening, with the Ukrainians having to redeploy some of their best artillery to Kherson region, where of course they then become targets for the Russian Air Force and for the Russian drone operators. Now, on the topic of artillery, there was an interesting commentary on Slavyangrad, which says that the Russians now, by their own calculations, have destroyed 2/3 of Ukraine's arsenal of M777 howitzers, that the days of the M777 howitzer in Ukraine are coming to a close. That may be true. But anyway, it does seem to be the case that the Ukrainians are becoming again massively outmatched in artillery. They're short of ammunition. Their guns, as they admitted themselves, are becoming worn out, and the Russians are destroying more and more of them. Now, this, of course, just a few weeks after the West was claiming, Western commentators were claiming, as I remember, that Ukraine had achieved an artillery advantage over the Russians. It's only a short time since those claims were made, and we see how all of that has faded away. So, a dismal military picture. And in fact, there was an interesting article, or perhaps actually not such an interesting article, but there was an article I saw in Le Monde, which perhaps summarizes the situation best. At least the title does. The article itself is pretty banal. But the article puts it this way: a perfect storm is brewing for Ukraine and its allies. Negative developments everywhere are converging. And the subtitle goes on to say, Ukraine and its allies have entered a difficult military, diplomatic and economic phase. And this is absolutely true. And the perfect storm is coming together. It seems to me it's not a storm, it's a hurricane. And it's looking increasingly likely that when it strikes, it will blow everything ahead of it away. So, what does the West do? Well, we've had two articles that I found interesting over the last couple of hours. One was by President Biden, and it is in the Washington Post. Now, I'm not going to cover this article in detail. Most of the article is about the situation in the Middle East, where President Biden basically is trying to shore up public support in the United States for his policy of supporting Israel in its conflict with Hamas. He's obviously feels himself under pressure. He notes the increasing demands for ceasefires that are coming from various people, and he wants to reaffirm his support for Israel, and that's what the bulk of the article says. But on Ukraine, he also has a few things to say, and I have to say, they seemed to me to amount to nothing very much. He talked about the importance of continuing to support Ukraine. He didn't suggest anything that amounted to any kind of exit strategy. He said that the United States is the essential nation. This is the rhetoric we've been hearing so much about over the last 30 years. It really began with Madeleine Albright talking about the United States being the indispensable nation that can see further and understand better than any other what is happening. But then President Biden sticks with that. That was said by Madeleine Albright in the 90s, at the height of America's post-Cold War power. The world has changed, but it seems that President Biden and his administration really find it all but impossible to think beyond it. He says that the United States is the essential nation. We rally allies and partners to stand up to aggressors and make progress towards a brighter, more peaceful future. The world looks to us to solve the problems of our time. This is the duty of leadership, and America will lead. For if we walk away from the challenges of today, the risk of conflict could spread, and the costs to address them will only rise. We will not let that happen. So, rhetoric, which, well, I don't personally think it was correct in the 1990s, but at least on the basis of the power realities, you could just about see why people were saying it at that time. The rhetoric of the 1990s, President Biden clings to the United States as the essential nation. It has a duty to stand up to what he calls aggressors, and a duty of leadership, which I have to say does seem to me to be intended, above all, to address the growing doubts and skepticism about this amongst the public in the United States. But as to an actual way out of the crisis in Ukraine, the perfect storm that Le Monde is talking about, he really had nothing to say. He says, we know from 2 world wars of the past century that when aggression in Europe goes unanswered, the crisis does not burn itself out. It draws America in directly. That is why our commitment to Ukraine today is an investment in our security. It prevents a broader conflict tomorrow. We are keeping American troops out of this war by supporting the brave Ukrainians defending their freedom and homeland. We are providing them with weapons and economic assistance to stop Putin's drive for conquest before the conflict spreads further. This is the old rhetoric. If you go back to Vietnam, you will find it expressed there that the United States has to continue support its allies, in this case Ukraine, in that case Vietnam, indefinitely, because if they didn't fight America's enemies there, then American soldiers would have to fight them here, or to be more precise, in Europe, in the rest of Europe. And it's an utterly sterile approach to the problem, because basically what President Biden is talking about here is indefinite support for Ukraine and indefinite war. And this article, coincidentally, has come out at exactly the same time as there has been an article by our old friend Richard Haass in, I believe it was, Foreign Affairs. And this article by Richard Haass is interesting, and it discusses the situation going forward, and its title is Redefining Success in Ukraine. And it says, a new strategy must balance means and ends. Note that this article comes directly after the magical thinking article in the Wall Street Journal. So some people are starting to say that the situation in Ukraine at the moment is unsustainable. And that is what Richard Haass says, former head of the Council of Foreign Relations, the man who has been trying to reach out to the Russians for several months now, who's been in contact with Lavrov, who sent people to Moscow, who's been trying to see some kind of way forward. And the article begins, Ukraine's counteroffensive appears to have stalled, just as wet and cold weather brings to a close the second fighting season in Kiev's efforts to reverse Russian aggression. We see that it has not prevented the Russians from advancing, but it's true that the Ukrainians aren't advancing anywhere anymore. And then the article goes on to say, at the same time, the political willingness to continue providing military and economic support to Ukraine has begun to erode in both the United States and Europe. These circumstances necessitate a comprehensive reappraisal of the current strategy that Ukraine and its partners are pursuing. And then the article comes to what is perhaps the key paragraph. Such a reassessment reveals an uncomfortable truth, namely that Ukraine and the West are on an unsustainable trajectory, one characterized by a glaring mismatch between ends and the available means. Kiev's war aims, the expulsion of Russian forces from Ukrainian land and the full restoration of its territorial integrity, including Crimea, remain legally and politically unassailable. But strategically, they are out of reach, certainly for the near future, and quite possibly beyond. So, this, of course, flatly contradicting, or at least not contradicting, but exploding the language behind President Biden's Washington Post article. Washington Post article, US, the essential nation, it has a duty to lead, it must go on supporting countries like Ukraine, defending themselves against aggression. Richard Haass doesn't, of course, refer to that directly. Perhaps his article in Foreign Affairs was written before Biden's article appeared. Most probably he had no knowledge of Biden's article in the Washington Post. But he says that the current trajectory is unsustainable. He can also see the perfect storm that Le Monde is talking about. But what does he propose? He doesn't propose substantive negotiations with the Russians about peace and security in Europe. He proposes one of two strategies. Strategy one, try to freeze the conflict, try to get Ukraine to enter into negotiations with the Russians to freeze the conflict. Ukraine doesn't give up its claim to the territory that Russia occupies. It continues to seek eventual return of its territory, only it doesn't do so now. It looks for a ceasefire, an indefinite ceasefire. It's the Korean variant, or perhaps to be more precise, the West German variant. You accept that 20% of Ukrainian territory, well, what Richard Haass considers to be Ukrainian territory, will continue to be occupied by the Russians, but in the meantime, you build up Ukraine. You try to build up Ukraine in the same way that the West once built up West Germany and South Korea. So that's undoubtedly his preferred outcome. And it's the outcome that he's been trying to get the Russians to agree to in all of these pre-negotiation negotiations that he and his people have been undertaking with the Russians for many months, which I've discussed previously. We had that article in Moscow Times some months ago, which spoke about them. So that's still his preferred option. As I've said many times, the Russians are bound to reject it. They've rejected it outright many times. And Richard Haass now has come round to accepting that this really isn't going to happen. So he has come to the alternative view, which is that Ukraine, instead of negotiating for a ceasefire and a freezing of the conflict, should go over to the defensive. It should give up its attempts to launch offensives. These are massively costly. They're burning through Western defense capabilities. Let's instead withdraw to defendable lines, copy what the Russians did in the winter and spring of last winter and spring, build up for fortifications, lay minefields, hold the Russians at bay, and do so indefinitely until eventually the Russians themselves exhaust themselves and presumably come to some sort of terms. It's an idea that's been floated before. It's appeared in the Financial Times. It would reduce the attrition on the Ukrainian forces. It would eventually perhaps lead to some more positive outcome. I have to say, this proposal looks to me as unrealistic as any other. Now, back in August, George Beebe and Jim Webb suggested in, I think it was Time magazine, or it might have been Newsweek, one of those two, that Ukraine should give up the offensive, which was still underway at that time, go on the defensive, build up its fortifications. But they also suggested that Ukraine begin serious negotiations with the Russians. What Richard Haass and the Council for Foreign Relations are doing is that they're taking the one part of this proposal by Beebe and Webb, going on to the defensive, but they're not prepared to engage in proper negotiations with the Russians. And this is an unviable strategy. I've touched on the huge military build-up that the Russians are engaged in. And where is Ukraine going to establish these huge defense lines that it would need? Where is it going to find the troops and the machines and the men to man these defense lines? And we saw from earlier in the program that the Russians are applying pressure on the Ukrainians all the time, precisely so as to prevent the Ukrainians from doing this very thing of creating these defense lines, building up their forces in the rear, achieving the kind of objective that Richard Haass is now recommending that they do. Moving to a defensive strategy and seeking substantive negotiations, as Beebe and Webb suggested, would be a rational strategy. Going on to the defensive and trying to wage a defensive war against an immeasurably more powerful country, which is what Russia is, would for Ukraine be an absolutely hopeless endeavour, and one which I cannot imagine that the Western public would be prepared to support. So, there we are. Sterility. No real idea, no real plan. We see that President Biden and his administration are retreating into cliches, and we see that the supposed realist Richard Haass, all he can propose, in effect, are alternatives. One, the freeze, which has already been rejected, and the other, the going on to the indefinite defence, which is equally unsustainable. I've come to the straightforward view that this war is going to go to its ultimate military conclusion, and it is the one that the Russians are going to decide. Now, how long that will happen, how it will happen, is another question, one which we are going to have to see evolve over time. But that does seem to me the situation which we're in at the moment. Now, I'm going to turn to the situation briefly in the Middle East, because I spoke yesterday about these huge American military deployments in the Middle East. The Eisenhower, now apparently close to the Straits of Hormuz. The Ohio submarine also deployed there. The Gerald Ford is, of course, in the Eastern Mediterranean. There are American troops in the region. There are also, by the way, ships from Allied powers. France and Britain have also deployed warships in support of the American task force, or rather fleets that are gathering there. And I've had another interesting email from another extremely well-informed commentator. And this person has broken down the US deployments in the Middle East, and he has assessed that the US Navy group, or rather groups, in this region in the Middle East could conceivably launch a missile strike with up to 286 Tomahawk cruise missiles. Now that would be a massive strike. It would not be a massive strike by the terms of the strikes that we've seen in Ukraine. There, the Russians would launch strikes of 80 cruise missiles a day quite regularly over the course of the war. They never launched 286 cruise missiles on a single day, but they probably could do it if they were minded to. But, all right, this is a different war against perhaps a less resilient target. A strike with 286 Tomahawk cruise missiles would be an enormous strike. And of course, it would presumably be backed by the aircraft of the Gerald Ford and of the Eisenhower, and by some of these other warships, one of which at least is an aircraft carrier that America's allies have also deployed in the region. And the Israeli Air Force, of course, remains a massively potent force as well. So the assets, the military assets for some kind of a massive strike by the United States are indeed there in the Middle East. I would say again that for the moment, the political mood music, despite the presence of all of these forces, seems to be pointing in a different direction. Despite the ongoing fighting in Gaza, negotiations do still seem to be underway for prolonged humanitarian pauses and release in return for Hamas releasing hostages. Apparently, these negotiations have proved extremely rocky. Prime Minister Netanyahu resisted a call for a humanitarian pause, and anybody who reads what President Biden has to say in his article in the Washington Post can see that he still is resisting the calls for a ceasefire. But it does seem to me overall that that is still the direction in which events are going. But it is also the case that attacks on American bases in the Middle East apparently continue unabated. The Shia militia groups seem undeterred by the presence of all these American warships in the Middle East. Whatever instructions they're getting from Tehran to hold fire, if they are even getting these instructions, doesn't seem as if these instructions are being heeded. And the situation remains in the Middle East, remains extremely dangerous. I hope that we do find some way towards a humanitarian pause with all the political problems that will follow in its wake. Because, to say it straightforwardly, if we don't, the situation being in the Middle East, being as tense as it is, the risk of a major escalation of all these enormous military assets being used in some sort of all-out war with Iran, which it would undoubtedly be, become ever greater. So anyway, we will see what happens there, but no indication yet from the administration that there's any real change of policy, much in the way of new thinking about the Middle East, any more than there is about the situation in Ukraine. Well, this is where I finish my program today. More from me soon. Let me remind you once more that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. You can also support our you can also support our work, but also do yourself the benefit of going to our shop and buying the amazing things that you will find there. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.